At Thanksgiving dinner, my brother stood up with a wide grin, lifted his glass high, and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Let's all toast to the family, except her." Every head turned to me. For a second, there was a thick, awful silence, as if even they realized he had gone too far. But then the laughter started. First from my uncle, then my mother, then the whole table joined in, like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. My face burned. I could feel my hands shaking in my lap, my mouth trying to smile, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break right there at the table. I pushed back my chair. I didn't look at anyone. I couldn't. I just needed to get out of that room, out of that house, out of a family that could find a joke in my humiliation. I gripped my napkin in one hand to keep it together as I stood up. That was when my 15-year-old son, Mason, stood too. His chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. He held an envelope in his hand, his face pale, but his chin lifted with the stubborn bravery I had seen so many times before. He cleared his throat. Every conversation stopped. "Maybe they should read this first," Mason said. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. He just stood there, arm outstretched, holding the letter toward my grandfather at the head of the table. The room went dead quiet. You could hear the old clock ticking in the corner. You could hear the wind against the windows. You could hear the shallow, uneven breaths of the people who had just laughed at me. You could hear a pin drop. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday when I was younger. Something about the scent of cinnamon in the air, the kitchen packed with chatter, and the dining table covered in homemade dishes always made the house feel like magic. But this year, as I stood on the front porch with my son Mason staring at the heavy oak door, it just felt like walking straight into a fire. I tightened my grip on the pie I had baked that morning. Mason caught my eye and gave me a small nod, like he was telling me I could do this. Maybe I still believed, deep down, that if I showed up with a smile and a good attitude, things could finally be different. Maybe they would welcome me back. Maybe they had missed me. Inside, everything looked the same as it had when I was a little girl. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing. Laughter spilled out from the kitchen, where my brother Caleb's voice rang loudest, telling some story that had everyone doubled over. The table was already set, every plate perfectly aligned, wine glasses sparkling under the soft light. I spotted my mother, Darlene, bustling around, making sure everything was just right. My father, Walter, sat in his usual chair, nodding along to conversations without really joining in. Uncle Rick was already on his second beer, booming laughter echoing across the room. Grandpa Henry, thinner than I remembered, sat quietly at the head of the table, smiling to himself as if he had found some private joke in the chaos. No one looked up when we walked in, no one called out a hello or waved us over. For a moment, Mason and I just stood there, awkward and uncertain, as if we were strangers who had accidentally wandered into the wrong house. I forced a smile and moved toward the kitchen, setting the pie down on the counter, but my mother barely glanced at it. "You found the place all right," she said with a quick, tight smile, as if she wasn't sure whether she was glad to see me or not. Caleb came over, clapped Mason on the back like a coach, congratulating a good player, then turned to me with a smirk. "Didn't think you'd actually show," he said. I laughed too loudly, brushing it off like it was nothing, but Mason's jaw tightened. He hated when they talked to me like that. I reached for his hand under the table once we sat down, but he pulled his hand away, not from anger, but because he was holding something tight in his jacket pocket. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything. I had learned not to ask questions at Thanksgiving. Dinner started with the usual parade of dishes, everyone passing bowls back and forth, the clinking of silverware and low hum of conversations about jobs, new cars, the latest vacation Caleb had taken to Florida. I sat at the far end of the table next to Grandpa Henry, who patted my hand now and then, but stayed mostly quiet. It was like there was an invisible wall between me and the rest of them. No one asked about my job, my apartment, or even how Mason was doing in school. It was easier for them to pretend I wasn't there than to deal with the fact that I was living proof that not every family story ended in perfect marriages and smiling Christmas cards. Mason caught my eye a few times during dinner, his face tight with something he wasn't saying. I smiled at him as reassuringly as I could, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. When the plates were cleared and dessert was brought out, Caleb stood up, raising his glass with a wide, performative smile. His eyes skimmed right over me. The entire table turned toward him, ready for whatever joke or story he had planned. Caleb loved being the center of attention. He always had. I braced myself without even realizing I was doing it, muscles tensing as if I knew something was about to come crashing down. It was supposed to be a moment of celebration, a simple, harmless family toast. But when Caleb opened his mouth and pointed his glass at the table, I realized too late that this wasn't about bringing us closer. It was about reminding everyone exactly where I stood. "Let's all toast to the family," Caleb said, smiling that easy, perfect smile he had been flashing since he was 5 years old. Except her. There was a beat of stunned silence. For half a second, I thought someone might say something. I thought someone might tell him to stop. But then the laughter started, rolling down the table like a wave, swallowing me whole. I stared down at my empty plate, trying to breathe, wishing I could disappear, wishing I had never come at all. For a moment, I stayed frozen in my chair, the sound of their laughter crashing against me like a cold wave. I looked around the table, searching for anyone, even one person, who might meet my eyes and offer me a way out of this humiliation. My mother was dabbing at her mouth with a napkin, pretending not to notice. Uncle Rick wiped a tear of laughter from his eye. My father stared at his glass as if maybe, if he focused hard enough, he could disappear inside it. Grandpa Henry looked down at the table, disappointment written all over his worn face. I pushed my chair back. The screech of the legs scraping against the floor made a few heads turn, but no one said anything. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and stood up. My body felt numb and heavy, but I knew if I stayed even 1 second longer, I was going to break down right there in front of them, and I would never forgive myself for giving them that satisfaction. Mason stood up too, his chair scraping sharply against the hardwood. I turned toward him, my voice low and shaky as I said, "It's okay, Mason. Let's just go." I tried to take his arm, to lead him away from this mess, but he pulled away gently and stepped forward. He pulled something out of the inside pocket of his jacket. It was a white envelope, slightly crumpled. He held it in both hands like it was something fragile and important. His voice was clear, loud enough to reach every person at that long table. "Maybe before she goes," Mason said, "you should read this." The room went silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. My heart twisted in my chest. I wanted to tell him to stop, to sit down, that it was not worth it, but I could not find my voice. I stood there helpless as my 15-year-old son did something I had never been brave enough to do. Caleb leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest with a lazy smirk. "What's this? Some pity letter?" he said, the words dripping with mockery. Mason did not even look at him. He walked slowly around the table to where Grandpa Henry sat. The old man looked up at him, confusion flickering across his face, but when Mason placed the envelope gently in front of him, he took it without a word. Grandpa Henry adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers and opened the envelope. The paper inside crackled as he unfolded it. Mason stepped back and stood beside me, his hand brushing against mine, steady and strong. I squeezed it tightly. For a long, painful moment, Grandpa just stared at the letter. His lips moved silently as he read it to himself. Then slowly he cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "I want to talk about my mom," Grandpa began, his voice rough with emotion. "She is the strongest person I know." The words hit the room like a hammer. My mother stiffened. Caleb shifted in his seat, suddenly less sure of himself. Uncle Rick stared at his hands. Grandpa continued, reading each word carefully. "Most of you don't know what it has been like. You see her as someone who failed, someone who could not keep her family together. But you do not see the nights she stayed up late helping me with schoolwork when she had to be up at 5 for her second job. You do not see the way she went without new clothes or nice things so I could have everything I needed. You do not see how hard she fought to make me believe I was worth something, even when none of you ever told her she was." My throat burned. I wanted to cry, but I forced myself to stay standing, to listen to every word my son had written. Grandpa's voice shook a little now, but he kept going. "She is not a failure. She is not a disappointment. She's the best person in this family, and if you cannot see that, then maybe you are the ones who should be ashamed." No one moved. No one dared breathe. Mason stood tall beside me, his face pale but determined, his hand still tight around mine. Grandpa lowered the paper slowly. He looked straight at me, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, there was pride in his eyes. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I felt years of pain, humiliation, and rejection tightening in my chest, and then, slowly, loosening. For the first time, someone had said it out loud. Someone had defended me. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, the weight of truth settling over the table like a blanket. No one knew what to say. Caleb opened his mouth, but no words came out. My mother wiped her hands on her napkin, her face tight with something that might have been guilt, or maybe just anger that she had been called out in front of everyone. I held Mason's hand tighter and straightened my shoulders. I was not leaving in shame, not this time. They had heard the truth, whether they liked it or not, and I was not going to let them take my dignity from me again. For a few long seconds after Grandpa finished reading Mason's letter, no one said a word. The weight of it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I could see it written across their faces, the way their hands fidgeted, the way their eyes refused to meet mine. For once, they could not laugh it away or pretend it was just another one of Caleb's jokes. I felt Mason's hand squeeze mine again, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. For years, I had let them decide what I was worth. I had carried their shame like it was my own. I had accepted scraps of kindness and called it love. But standing there with my son beside me, I realized I did not owe them anything. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the tightness in my chest ease just a little. I stepped forward, moving toward the center of the table, feeling all their eyes finally following me. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady when I spoke. "Thank you, Mason," I said, my voice clear, ringing through the silent room. "Thank you for seeing me when so many others refused to." I turned and looked at each face around the table. My mother, her mouth pressed into a hard line, my father staring down at his plate. Uncle Rick, his hand frozen halfway to his wine glass. Caleb slouched in his chair, his smirk wiped clean away. "I came here today because I wanted to believe we were still a family," I said. I wanted to believe that maybe time had changed things, that maybe there was still a place for me here, but I see now that the place I was fighting for never really existed. My voice grew stronger with every word. Mason stood straight and tall beside me, his chin lifted proudly. I could feel his strength bolstering mine. "I am not the problem," I said. "I am not the one who needs to change. I have spent too many years trying to fit into a version of this family that only accepted me when I was easy to overlook. I am done apologizing for not being what you wanted." I could see the sting of my words landing. Caleb's jaw clenched. My mother's eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger. But I did not stop. I could not. "You laughed when Caleb humiliated me," I said. "You laughed because it was easier than admitting you have been part of the problem all along." But Mason was brave enough to tell the truth, and I owe it to him to stand in that truth with him. I reached for the pie I had brought, the one no one had touched, and held it in my hands for a second, feeling its weight. It was a silly thing, but it suddenly felt symbolic, a small piece of myself I had offered them, and they had ignored. I set it down carefully on the counter, no anger, no drama, just quiet finality. "We are leaving," I said, "and this time, I am not looking back." Mason moved beside me, his hand still in mine. Grandpa Henry stood slowly, pushing himself up with effort, and raised his glass high. "To Alara," he said, his voice strong despite the shake in it, "the bravest one of us all." For a second, no one else moved. Then, awkwardly, Uncle Rick lifted his glass. My father shifted in his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable. My mother sat stiff and unmoving. Caleb muttered something under his breath that I did not catch, but I no longer cared. I turned and walked toward the door, my head high. Mason matched my steps without hesitation. As I reached for the handle, Grandpa's voice came again, softer this time. "Don't be a stranger, Alara," he said. "Some of us still know what family means." I looked back at him, at the lines etched deep into his kind face, and nodded once. That was all the goodbye I needed. The cold air hit us as we stepped outside, but it felt fresh, clean, like a new beginning. Mason bumped my shoulder with his and smiled at me, a real, wide smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "You were awesome," he said. I laughed, the sound bubbling out of me without effort, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. "No," I said, wrapping my arm around him as we walked to the car. "You were." We drove away without looking back, the house shrinking behind us, nothing more than a place where a chapter had finally ended. For the first time in a long time, I was not chasing anyone's approval. I already had everything I needed sitting right beside me. The cold evening air stung my cheeks as Mason and I walked to the car, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, my heart still pounding with everything that had just happened inside that house. I could feel the letter Mason had written, still sitting heavy in the air behind us, a truth that none of them could take back now. I unlocked the car, and we both climbed in. I started the engine, and for a moment we just sat there, the only sound the low hum of the heater coming to life. I glanced over at Mason. He was staring out the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You okay?" I asked. He turned to me then, his brown eyes shining with a fierce kind of pride. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside me. For the first time in years, I felt more than okay. I felt strong. I reached over and squeezed his hand once before pulling out of the driveway. As we drove down the quiet street, the houses blurred past, their windows glowing with the kind of warmth I used to imagine belonged to everyone else's families. But tonight, I realized that warmth had nothing to do with perfect dinners or easy laughter. It was about loyalty. It was about who showed up for you when it mattered most. About halfway home, Mason shifted in his seat. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said. His voice was small, uncertain, a crack in the wall he had built up all night. "You didn't," I said firmly. "You made me feel seen." He nodded, but I could tell he still needed to hear more. I pulled the car into a small, empty parking lot by the park and turned off the engine. The car fell into silence, but it was a good silence, thick with understanding instead of shame. I turned to face him fully. "Mason, you did something tonight that grown adults could not do. You stood up when it was hard. You spoke the truth even though it was uncomfortable. You made them see me. That took courage most people never find their whole lives." His mouth twitched, like he wanted to smile but was not sure if he should. "I learned it from you," he said quietly. I blinked hard, willing the tears away, not because they were tears of sadness, but because they were tears of pride so sharp it took my breath away. "You have no idea how proud I am of you," I said. He smiled then, a real wide grin that lit up his whole face. We sat there for a minute longer before I turned the car back on and pulled onto the road again. The world outside seemed softer somehow. The heavy weight that had sat on my chest for so many years felt lighter. At home, we kicked off our shoes at the door, and Mason headed for the couch, flopping down and pulling a blanket over himself. I went into the kitchen and pulled out the second pie I had made, the one I had kept at home just in case. I carried 2 plates into the living room and set one down in front of him. "Best Thanksgiving ever," Mason said, his mouth full of apple pie. I laughed, sitting down beside him, pulling my own blanket around my shoulders. "Yeah," I said. "I think it might be." We watched a terrible old movie, the kind that made no sense but made us laugh anyway. We ate every crumb of that pie, and when Mason finally fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, I sat there for a long time just looking at him, memorizing the way he looked at peace. I thought about everything I had left behind at that table, everything I had finally let go of. I thought about how long I had fought to be accepted by people who would never see me for who I really was, and I thought about how much easier it was to breathe when you stopped asking for permission to exist. That night, as I tucked Mason into bed and turned off the lights, I knew we had built something stronger than anything that had ever existed inside those walls I left behind. We had built a family that would not break when things got hard, a family that would never mistake cruelty for love. It had taken me almost 40 years to find my voice, but I had found it. And the person who helped me find it was sleeping down the hall, brave enough to stand alone if he had to, but strong enough to carry both of us when I could not. I climbed into my own bed, pulling the blankets up around me. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel alone. I felt home. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the kitchen floor. I stood at the counter, pouring coffee, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a blanket. Mason slept in late, and for once there was no rush, no pressure to be anywhere or prove anything. I scrolled through my phone without much thought until a message caught my eye. It was from Grandpa Henry. "Proud of you, proud of him, love you, kiddo." I smiled, feeling the words settle deep inside my chest. Simple, solid, true. No apologies, no conditions, just love. The day passed slowly, filled with small, simple moments. I made pancakes that burned slightly at the edges. Mason teased me for it, laughing as he drowned them in syrup. We spent hours cleaning out the hall closet, something I had been putting off for months, tossing old shoes and jackets into donation bags, both of us making ridiculous guesses about where half the stuff had even come from. Later, while Mason was busy on his laptop, I sat down with a notebook and pen. Not a journal, not a letter to someone else, just a page for me. At the top, I wrote 2 words, what I learned. The first thing I wrote was this: family is not about who shares your blood. It is about who stands beside you when it matters. I paused, thinking back to last night, to the laughter, to the silence that followed Mason's voice cutting through it like a blade, to the strength it took to leave the table without lowering my head. The second thing I wrote, you do not need their approval to know your worth. For years, I had made my value a reflection of their acceptance. I had let their opinions decide how I saw myself. But last night, standing beside my son, hearing his voice call out the truth I had buried for so long, I realized that their view of me said more about them than it ever did about me. I wrote one more thing. Strength is quiet. It is patient. It shows up in the moments no one else notices. Mason had taught me that, in his steady way of loving me, without fanfare, in the way he carried himself when no one was watching, in the way he had pulled me back to myself when I had almost let their cruelty define me again. That night at Thanksgiving dinner had not destroyed anything important. It had revealed the cracks that were already there. It had peeled back the surface and shown the truth of who had my back and who never really had. And while it hurt, it was also freeing. When Mason finally came into the kitchen, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, I closed the notebook and smiled at him. "Want to help me figure out what to do with the rest of this pie?" I asked. He grinned. "Thought you'd never ask." We sat at the kitchen table, eating pie for lunch, talking about everything and nothing, college plans, movies we wanted to see, how the cat kept stealing socks from the laundry room. It was not flashy or dramatic. It was just real. As I listened to Mason laugh about something silly, I realized that what we had was more solid than anything I had ever fought for at that old house. We had loyalty. We had truth. We had love that did not need to be earned or proved. I thought about Thanksgiving dinners in the years ahead. I thought about tables filled with laughter that was kind, not cruel, about toasts made without exclusions, about family that we chose and built together, one honest day at a time. I looked at Mason, and for the first time in my life, I did not wonder if I belonged. I knew I did, not because someone gave me permission, but because we had built something real. And real things do not break just because someone else refuses to see their worth. Later, as Mason dozed off on the couch and I sat curled up in my favorite chair, I thought back to Grandpa Henry raising his glass. To Alara, the bravest one of us all. I carried those words with me into the quiet night, not as a wound to nurse, but as a truth to live by. Family, I had finally learned, is not where you are accepted when you are perfect. It is where you are loved even when you are not. And Mason and I, we had all the family we needed. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt like the outsider at your own table, I want you to know you are not alone. Family is not always about blood. It is about love, loyalty, and the people who see your worth even when others refuse to. If you felt something while listening, please take a second to like this video. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are enough. Leave a comment below. I would love to hear your story too. And if you want more real stories about strength, healing, and finding your voice, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here. You are part of this family now,